of the TB Think Tank webinar series, which takes place on a monthly basis. This session is titled Bedaquiline Susceptibility Surveillance Using Routine Laboratory Data, South Africa. So the session will be presented by Dr. Harry Moultrie only today. A quick introduction on today's speaker. Our speaker for today is the Senior Medical Epidemiologist at the Center for Tuberculosis, National Institute for Communicable Diseases, which is also known as NICD. His current research focuses on COVID-19, TB surveillance, and the geospatial distribution of TB in South Africa. He's convened the South African COVID-19 Modeling Consortium and was a member of the South African Ministerial Advisory Committee on COVID-19. He is, of course, a member of the South African National TB Think Tank and has served on a number of local, national, and international committees and has published more than 60 peer-reviewed publications. So before I hand over to our speaker for today, I'd just like to encourage everyone to please engage, provide commentary, and ask questions under the Q&A tab at the top right corner of your screen. I'll hand over to you, Dr. Harry.
Thank you so much, Nolwazi, and afternoon all, and welcome. And thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to be able to present this. And just a quick apologies. I know we scheduled this for May, but I was unable to present then because I was actually acutely ill and wasn't able to attend. So I'm just putting my slides onto presentation mode. Can I get my laser pointer? And can you confirm, Nolwazi, that you can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thanks so much. So afternoon all, I'm going to be talking about the bedaquiline susceptibility surveillance using routine laboratory data in South Africa, really focusing on the period July 2019 through November 2023. The overview of my talk, I intend to address four sort of issues. First of all, the implementation of bedaquiline and bedaquiline phenotypic drug susceptibility testing, or PDST, in South Africa. A little bit about acquired and primary bedaquiline resistance, a little bit about the trends in bedaquiline and joint bedaquiline fluoroquinolone resistance in South Africa, and lastly, a cross-sectional analysis of the prevalence of bedaquiline resistance and associated factors between March and November 2023. Turning to the implementation of bedaquiline and PDST in South Africa. Late in 2012 in South Africa, we started a bedaquiline clinical access program, and that actually commenced just before the FDA provided bedaquiline with an accelerated approval. And this was the first new TB drug available in 40 years. What we can see in this graph in the black line are the total number of drug-resistant TB episodes within the EDR web by month, and in the dotted green line, the number or the percentage of those regimens which were containing bedaquiline. And what we see is that we started off in the clinical access program with fairly small numbers, and then in May 2015, we implemented bedaquiline for pre-XDR and XDR at specialized sites, and we began the bedaquiline drug sensitivity surveillance program. In June 2017, we started the process of decentralizing the management of MDR TB, and by June 2018, we had an all-oral regimen for rifampicin-resistant TB containing bedaquiline. At that point, we also implemented bedaquiline PDST testing, or drug sensitivity testing, for patients with fluoroquinolone resistance, second-line injectable resistance, and or dual INH mutations. But you had to have one of those categories in order to have a bedaquiline phenotypic drug susceptibility testing. Finally, in July 2021, we started the BPAL clinical access program, and in March 2023, we released guidelines suggesting that bedaquiline and nasalid PDST should be implemented for all patients with rifampicin-resistant TB. So what we see here is actually in the green line, the percentage of patients on EDR-Web with a drug-resistant TB on a bedaquiline-containing regimen, so really exceeded 90% for much of this period. Turning to bedaquiline use in South Africa, we've obviously been at the forefront of this internationally, and a large number of studies have been conducted in South Africa. And I'm just going to highlight one or two of those. This first study looks at the high treatment success rate for NDR-TB and extensively drug-resistant TB when using a bedaquiline-containing regimen. And what we see is that the use of bedaquiline, and so the top two lines, is strongly associated with a decreased mortality or an increased proportion surviving compared to those who did not receive a bedaquiline containing regimen for NDR in blue or for XDR in red. The Center for TB, National Reference Laboratory, and many of our colleagues here at the Center for TB have been involved in a large number of publications and analysis and studies to look at bedaquiline susceptibility testing in the country. This work has led to the definition of breakpoints for bedaquiline resistance, the validation of bedaquiline PDST testing methods, and has led to informing guidelines. So a large portion of the global work on bedaquiline PDST has been undertaken by the lab at the Center for TB and by South African colleagues. Turning to bedaquiline resistance mechanisms, it was first described in 2015, so sort of 3 years after the approval from the FDA. And the genetic basis of resistance, there are 3 different mechanisms by which Mycobacterium TB can develop or acquire resistance to bedaquiline. The first is an ATPE target-based. This results in a high level resistance to bedaquiline, but is fairly rare. The second mechanism is the RV06780 efflux pump repressor, which is a much more common mechanism of acquiring resistance to bedaquiline. And what that effectively does is that the efflux pump, which pumps the bedaquiline out of the cell, gets overexpressed and overactive, and so the drug gets pumped out of the cell. And then there are some other targets, the PEPQ or RV1979C, and the consequences of that are less well characterized. But as noted, the RV06780 is the predominant mechanism for bedaquiline resistance. Important to sort of think up front about the difference between acquired and primary bedaquiline resistance. So acquired resistance, bedaquiline has an incredibly long half-life of sort of about 5 months. And the implications of that is that treatment interruptions, result in a long tail of continued suboptimal exposure to bedaquiline, which is unsupported by other drugs, and that increases the risk of acquisition of resistance through mutations. And similarly to that, so inadequate optimized background regimens, where the bedaquiline is not adequately supported by other agents, can also increase the risk of acquiring bedaquiline resistance. So acquired bedaquiline resistance, where a person with bedaquiline-sensitive TB is started on bedaquiline-containing regimen and acquires it during the course of treatment. Of course, primary resistance is a different mechanism, and that is when a person who has bedaquiline-resistant TB transmits it de novo to a person who previously did not have TB, and that person acquires or is infected with a bedaquiline-resistant strain. And what we do know is that with the widespread use of bedaquiline, or any other agent for that matter, the infectious circulating pool of resistant strains expands. And once established, antibiotic resistance is more often due to primary resistance rather than acquired. And a transmission model for multi-drug resistant TB, in fact, by Kendall et al., published in 2015, suggests that really the vast majority of NDR TB globally, so north of 80% to even possibly 90%, some variability by country, however, is as a result of primary resistance rather than acquired resistance. So the transmission of bedaquiline resistance likely to become the predominant mechanism of bedaquiline resistance as the number of patients on bedaquiline expands. And as you can see, that expansion has happened in South Africa. So a few other selected studies on the emergence of bedaquiline resistance, which is perhaps worth noting. The first was a retrospective study conducted in Cape Town in 2016-2017 among 40 patients who remained culture positive after 4 months on a bedaquiline-containing regimen. So these were patients who clearly were culture positive, 4 months on bedaquiline, so failing treatment, remaining culture positive. But of those, 12 or 31% had acquired bedaquiline resistance, and 8% had primary bedaquiline resistance. We should treat the percentages of low numbers, obviously with only 40 in the denominator, with some caution. The second study was the publication of the prevalence of bedaquiline resistance in South Africa from 2015 through 2019, using the bedaquiline surveillance program data instituted by the NICD and Prof. Nazir Ismail. And in that study, we found 3.8% bedaquiline resistance at baseline, with a further 2.3% developing resistance during treatment. And in that study, the efflux pump RV0678 was the sole genetic basis for the resistance. Turning slightly abroad into sort of other studies, a systematic review conducted by Malik et al. Suggested that about 2.2% of patients on bedaquiline acquired bedaquiline resistance during their treatment. But just to note that involves studies and data from a large number of countries, and not necessarily applicable to South Africa, given the differences perhaps in resistance to other drugs within regimens. There was a Kunkel et al. Study number 4 conducted a study to assess the trade-offs between mortality, resistance, and transmission of various strategies of implementing bedaquiline resistance for different groups of patients. So they specifically looked, and just to note that this was published in 2016, so it is the old definitions of pre-XDR and XDR. But they assessed across these ideas of life expectancy, minimizing resistance, and minimizing secondary cases, which strategy would provide the best benefit. And the strategies they assessed was providing bedaquiline to all patients with NDR-TB, patients with pre-XDR and XDR-TB, or just those with XDR-TB. And what they found was that if we provided bedaquiline to all patients with NDR, you can see from these black bars, we would maximize the life expectancy of patients. We would minimize acquired resistance of XDR under the old definitions, and we'd also minimize the secondary cases and life years lost. So providing bedaquiline to all patients is clearly beneficial. However, what it does come at is a cost of increased bedaquiline resistance amongst patients. And so you sort of see this sort of 0% that none of their model runs suggested that this strategy of all NDR, providing bedaquiline for all NDR cases, would provide protection against bedaquiline resistance. And in fact, in their model, they estimated that about 5.9%, confidence intervals from 2 to 9, would acquire bedaquiline resistance if bedaquiline was part of all NDR-TB treatment. But just to note that this would also, however, decrease the XDR-TB under the old definitions by protecting the other drugs. Lastly, there's a study recently published at the end of 2023 looking at samples from Mozambique, 800 samples. And what they found is that the bedaquiline resistance, you can see here in the blue, increased between 2016 and 2021 from 3 to 14% amongst these samples. But it is somewhat unclear the representativeness of these samples of TB in Mozambique, in that the sampling frame it was sort of what was available rather than a sort of an active sampling frame. But quite a substantial increase in bedaquiline resistance in Mozambique amongst the samples with the whole genome sequencing. Also worth noting that 61%, or 37 out of 61 of those with bedaquiline resistance in Mozambique had fluoroquinoline sensitive TB. So a substantial proportion had FLQS TB. So the objectives of today's presentation, of today's analysis, is at a test level rather than at a patient level. The first three objectives, looking at test level data, to describe the long-term trends of bedaquiline PDST volumes amongst patients with RRTB. Secondly, to assess the implementation of the updated bedaquiline PDST guidelines. In March 2023, we provided guidelines which said that all patients with rifampicin-resistant TB should have a bedaquiline PDST conducted. So that objective is to look at the implementation of that. The third objective is to assess the trends in bedaquiline drug susceptibility and the joint bedaquiline fluoroquinoline resistance patterns amongst patients with RRTB against a test level. And then finally, at a patient level, the last part of this presentation, I'll turn to a cross-sectional analysis to describe the prevalence of bedaquiline resistance amongst patients who had their first ever bedaquiline test conducted under the period of the new guidelines between March and November 2023 in provinces which had achieved at least a 50% coverage of bedaquiline PDST amongst RRTBs. So we've got to go through this first period really in order to understand the data generation process, because we're using routine laboratory data in order to understand how what that means for the patient level data. So methods in brief: for the test level data, we exported all data from the NICD Central Surveillance Data Warehouse in February 2024. We had to write sense of the data by 81 days back to the 30th of November, given the long turnaround times for bedaquiline samples. And then when we had more than one bedaquiline test conducted on the same sample, we took the result from the National TB Reference Laboratory. But where we had two bedaquiline PDST tests done on the same sample, but from two non-TB reference laboratory labs, we held the bedaquiline resistant result. The sort of drug susceptibility for rifampicin, RNH, fluoroquinolone, second-line injectables, and linezolid was determined for each patient using a window period of 182 days prior to the bedaquiline sample date to 28 days after the date of the bedaquiline, and 91% of these results, for example, for fluoroquinolone, were obtained on the same sample as the bedaquiline resistant result. We reviewed laboratory turnaround times from time of sample collection until the result reviewed by a pathologist. And lastly, we looked at the implementation of the bedaquiline PDST reflex testing for all RIFRs by province and month using patient-level data. So we started off with just over 10,000 samples for bedaquiline PDST sampling. We ended up excluding some of these. Some of these were RIF-S's or RIF unknowns, and about 200 patients had duplicate samples, same patient, same day, same result. So duplicate was dropped. Turning to the bedaquiline test level results, we had 9,688 results. But then we had some for whom we could not find a fluoroquinolone test window. For fluoroquinolone susceptibility were excluded or were indeterminate. And so we landed up with just over 9,500 samples with both a bedaquiline and a fluoroquinolone for joint distributions. So, not surprising, this graph shows from June 2019 through to November 2023 the daily numbers of bedaquiline PDST tests conducted in the country, along with the 7-day centered moving average. And what we see is a fairly stable period right up until March, perhaps February, where the numbers of bedaquiline PDST tests were fairly stable, and patients were only eligible for a bedaquiline susceptibility test if they had fluoroquinolone resistance SLI or high dual resistance mutations to iron and H. And then what we sort of see is the dotted line in red is here set as the 19th of March, and we do see a substantial increase in the number of PDST tests that have been conducted as we introduce the new guidelines suggesting that bedaquiline resistance testing should be conducted in all patients with rifampicin-resistant TB. There's obviously, and not surprisingly, substantial provincial variability. So we've got 9 provinces here. Just to note that the y-axis differs to improve legibility. So, for example, Eastern Cape and Western Cape go up to 15, whereas sort of in KwaZulu-Natal, where there's some of the other provinces, the numbers are much smaller. But in most provinces, we do see an increase in the bedaquiline PDST testing. Some provinces responded quite late. For example, the Free State, you can see only sort of a small increase perhaps towards the end of the data series. So quite a substantial provincial variability in the numbers of PDSTs, bedaquiline PDSTs conducted. But of course, that doesn't take into account the provincial burden of rifampicin-resistant TB, and so the absolute numbers are perhaps not that informative. So in order to address that, we looked at the coverage of bedaquiline PDST tests amongst patients who had a first rifampicin-resistant TB NAT test. So we restricted here patients who had their very first, since 2019, rifampicin-resistant TB NAT test in the period of June to November. And then we looked amongst those individuals who had not previously had a RIF-R test, what proportion of them had a bedaquiline PDST result available. And in the hexagon plot on the left, so the heat map, what we see are the provinces going down from Eastern Cape to Western Cape, the months from June to November going across the bottom, and the colors and the numbers in white are the percentage of patients with a RIF-R test who had a bedaquiline test available, and this is by the month of the RIF-R TB NAT test. And what we can really see is that the Western Cape achieved substantially sort of higher percentage coverages, getting up to sort of 70% of patients with rifampicin-resistant having a bedaquiline resistance test result. KwaZulu-Natal not doing too badly, perhaps a drop at the end here where we had an issue with culturing in November, but achieving over 50%. And the Eastern Cape sort of in 1 month achieving 50%, but sort of a little bit slower after that. But nationally, only 43% of individuals with rifampicin resistance, presumed new rifampicin resistance based on the criteria, had a bedaquiline PDST conducted. And this higher coverage in the Western Cape is really likely largely the result of 2 initial samples for drug resistance TB reflex testing, with the second sample reflexed to the XCR and bedaquiline testing, should the first sample prove to be rifampicin resistant in a TB NAT test. We can see on the right some sort of, this is a box and whisker plot with outliers showing the time from the rifampicin resistant sample to the bedaquiline resistant sample collection. Western Cape, the interquartile range is 0 because of the reflex testing, as is in the Northern Cape, where in those patients who we did get a bedaquiline, coverage was collected on the same day largely, but some provinces serve the collection of the bedaquiline lagging the RIF-R test by a number of days or weeks. Turning quickly to turnaround times to explain why we had to right censor these data. What you can see is the data for South Africa from March 2023. That is the median and interquartile range of the total bedaquiline PDST turnaround time from collection until the results were reviewed. And what we can see is while there's been a decline somewhat in more recent months leading up to November 2023, we remember we had to right censor this data because of the long turnaround time that we've got. Sort of taking up to 60 days or 56 days in November, the median turnaround time nationally, interquartile range 40 to 72 days. from the time a sample is collected until a bedaquiline PDST result is reviewed and officially available. There is obviously substantial provincial variability. Some provinces taking substantially longer, so 75 or 80 days medians, and some of those interquartile ranges really sort of approaching 80 days for some provinces for turnaround time for bedaquiline resistance testing. So turning to, I suppose, what people have been waiting for, which is the bedaquiline resistance amongst these samples. So if we go back to 2019, what we can see is here the number of bedaquiline tests by month, and we see the sudden increase as previously shown in the number of bedaquiline tests, and that is associated with a decrease on the right-hand y-axis in the proportion or percentage of those tests which were bedaquiline resistant. So we were previously running at about 15 to 20%. We increased our testing, and as expected, the proportion of tests which came back bedaquiline resistance decreased as we were now increasing, those eligible for testing included those with IR-TB, not just pre-XDR and XDR-TB. But still remaining quite high at about 10% of tests after the implementation of the updated guidelines in March 2023, coming back bedaquiline resistance. We do see a slight uptick here in the total absolute number. This is on the left axis in red of the bedaquiline resistant tests as a result of this increase in testing, despite the decrease in the percentage coming back bedaquiline resistance. Perhaps worth noting, and given the previous slide on the provincial heterogeneity, on the coverage of bedaquiline PDST testing, that we do need to treat sort of national estimates with some caution, as there's substantial sort of differences between provinces and coverage, and certainly in some provinces it's seeming that in this period, bedaquiline resistance testing for RIF-R was not fully implemented. So now on the left-hand graph, what we do is we've taken the bedaquiline and the fluoroquinolone, and we have combined those into a joint susceptibility test result. And in yellow, what we see here, the number of tests on the y-axis, the month going along the x-axis. And what we see in the yellow is the number of patients with bedaquiline sensitive, fluoroquinolone sensitive, so sensitive to both drugs. And we see this massive increase as a result of the change in guidelines, as expected, as we change to testing all those with RIF-R. But what we also do see, if we sort of drill into the monthly data, just sort of restricted since March through to November of 2023, what we do see, which was perhaps somewhat surprising to ourselves, is that the bedaquiline resistant fluoroquinolone sensitive, so these are patients who are bedaquiline resistant fluoroquinolone sensitive, generally would not previously have been tested for bedaquiline resistance unless they had second-line injectables or INH resistance. The absolute numbers of those individuals actually being higher in quite a few months, in 3 months highlighted in red, than the number of patients with bedaquiline resistance and fluoroquinolone resistant TB. So this is in total in this sort of this table of 4,000 individuals, and what we see is in these months we had a higher number of bedaquiline resistant fluoroquinolone sensitive patients. Now those are clearly not classified under the WHO classification of drug resistant TB, in that they would likely fall, since this is RIF-R patients, as either reported as RIF-R or NDR, but being fluoroquinolone sensitive, they do not meet the criteria for pre-XDR or XDR TB. So, the overall prevalence of bedaquiline resistance, it was 10% across these months, similar to what I had shown in the previous graphs, perhaps dropping a bit as we increased, widened the scope of who was tested in the provinces. We must remember, however, the test level data, this is test level data, that the bedaquiline resistance prevalence is, however, going to be biased upwards because of repeat tests and those not responding to treatment, and inclusion of provinces with lower coverage of BDQ reflex testing. So in order to deal with this last sort of issue here, where test level data is certainly going to overestimate bedaquiline resistance, I'll come to it just now. Sorry, got a slide I wasn't expecting. But what is important is that this data, Western Cape had the highest coverage of bedaquiline resistance coverage testing amongst patients with rifampicin-resistant TB. So turning to the Western Cape, just over more recent periods, so you can see it more clearly. You've got absolute numbers of tests on the left, you've got the proportion of tests on the right for the Western Cape. And as before, we see this increase in the BDQ, FLQS numbers of tests and in the percentage. But what we do see is that this, in the red line, which is the bedaquiline-resistant fluoroquinolone sensor, substantially higher in both numbers and percentages than those with bedaquiline-resistant and fluoroquinolone-resistant TB. So to deal with the biases of the repeat testing and the problems with test level data, we conducted a cross-sectional study, and we restricted this to 3 provinces: the Eastern Cape, the KwaZulu-Natal, and Western Cape. And we chose those provinces because they'd obtained a bedaquiline PDST coverage amongst new RIF-R cases of at least 50% in at least 1 month in the period of March to November. So really trying to get a handle on what's going on in patients with bedaquiline testing under the new guidelines since March 2023, which indicate that all patients with RIF-R should have a bedaquiline testing. We also excluded all patients who had had a bedaquiline PDST prior to March 2023. So anytime they'd had a bedaquiline test between 2019 and 2023, we excluded those patients because difficult to tell whether these were new episodes or older episodes or tests of patients who were currently on a regimen and were not responding. And then we linked these data with the EDR web using a combination of deterministic and probabilistic linkages with a manual review to assess prior exposure to bedaquiline and clofazimine. And overall, 82% of the patients of the 2,300 with a bedaquiline PDST, we were able to link 82% of 1,000, nearly 1,900 of them to an EDR web record containing information on exposures and treatment. So overall, in this cross-sectional study, in these 3 provinces, we restricted 2,308 individuals, and we started finding some interesting things. So first of all, the combined prevalence of bedaquiline resistance, and remember this is patient level, not test level now, in the 3 provinces was 6.5%. So 149 out of the 2,308 were bedaquiline resistance, but there was substantial provincial variability. So the Eastern Cape, the prevalence of bedaquiline resistance 3.6%, 4.8% in KwaZulu-Natal, and 10.2% in the Western Cape, substantially higher. Yeah. I think there are 1 or 2 other things I'd like to draw your attention to. So if we look amongst the 149 patients with bedaquiline resistance here, what we can see is that 96 of them, of the 149, which is 65%, had fluoroquinolone sensitive TB. So bedaquiline resistance TB in terms of absolute numbers, getting a greater contribution from fluoroquinolone sensitive TB than fluoroquinolone resistance or indeterminate or missing. But remember that the denominator, fluoroquinolone sensitive TB, is now substantially larger than that for fluoroquinolone resistant TB. And so looking at the percentages the other way, we actually find what people more might have expected, that amongst patients with fluoroquinolone resistant TB, 52 out of 237, or 18%, were bedaquiline resistance, giving an unadjusted odds ratio of 4 for bedaquiline resistance amongst those with fluoroquinolone resistant TB. So 2 things can be true at the same time. Patients with fluoroquinolone resistant TB are substantially, unadjusted odds ratio of 4, confidence interval 3 to 6, more likely to have bedaquiline resistance. But at the same time, given the higher numbers of fluoroquinolone sensitive TB in absolute numbers, more than 2/3, or no, about 65%, nearly 2/3 of those who were bedaquiline resistant were actually fluoroquinolone sensitive, having fluoroquinolone sensitive TB. A few other things, that the overall prevalence of linezolid was incredibly low, with only 5 patients with linezolid resistance, or 0.2% amongst the patients. And then lastly, an adjusted odds ratio for bedaquiline resistance in the Western Cape, adjusted for age, sex, previous bedaquiline clofazimine exposure, and calendar month, still remaining at about 3 times that of the baseline, which is in this case the Eastern Cape. So despite adjustment, the risk for bedaquiline resistance in the Western Cape remaining higher. Turning to the DR classification in the cross-sectional study, so here we're dividing up in the graph into the RIF mono, the MDR, our fluoroquinolone sensitive bedaquiline resistance group, the pre-XDR and the XDR group. What we see is that this fluoroquinolone sensitive bedaquiline resistance group actually accounts for 7.6% of all patients with drug-resistant or RIF-resistant TB in the Western Cape, lower proportions in Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. So we certainly seem to have an increased risk of fluoroquinolone sensitive and bedaquiline resistance patients in the Western Cape. And these in red boxes were previously reported by the NICD in our quarterly reports as either being RIF-R-TB or MDR-TB, depending on the INH susceptibility, but do not meet the criteria for pre-XDR or XDR. So in April of 2024, we updated our quarterly reports on the NICD to include a group called RIF-R, rifampicin-resistant fluoroquinolone sensitive bedaquiline resistant. And you can see this now on the last box of the quarterly reports, which are provided by province and district and sub-district. And this was the reports released for Q2. Q2 obviously being provisional in that there's considerable lag in turnaround times of bedaquiline. But what we do see is the total number of cases in this group exceeding nationally the number of XDR cases. Turning to the effective calendar time on bedaquiline resistance in the cross-sectional study, I suppose the good news is simply in the green here, you can see it, and there's no indication of an increase in risk of bedaquiline resistance with time within the cross-sectional study. So looking at Q2, Q3, and Q4 of those data, the adjusted odds ratios are fairly similar, and these were adjusted for province, previous exposure to bedaquiline clofazimine, previous drug-resistant TB treatment, and fluoroquinolone susceptibility, but no indication that the adjusted odds ratio for bedaquiline resistance having adjusted for these issues, which I think are relevant from a sort of causal diagram perspective rather than a backwards or forwards modeling perspective being relevant. We're not seeing an indication during this period of increased bedaquiline resistance with time. So I suppose this asks the question why the higher prevalence of bedaquiline resistance in the Western Cape, and I don't have an answer. Sometimes the answers lie outside of the data that are available to us, but I have some ideas of potential hypotheses. So the first thing to note is that both the higher coverage of bedaquiline PDST amongst patients with rifampicin resistant and better linkages within the Western Cape as a result of the Provincial Health Data Centre file numbers, I would have expected this result in a lower estimate or a lower midpoint estimate of bedaquiline resistance compared to the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, but actually we find the opposite in the Western Cape. We also looked at the data in terms of the timing and use of bedaquiline and clofazimine in the Western Cape compared to the Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, and even other provinces not in the cross-sectional survey, and we didn't find a substantial difference there, but data haven't been shown in the interest of time. There's a possibility that we've got a higher force of infection with the clonal expansion of bedaquiline-resistant strains, and the analysis of whole genome sequencing is currently underway. And it is possible that we really do have a higher force of infection in the Western Cape if we just sort of look at the quarterly TB NARD presenting to percentage testing positive by province, with the Western Cape being substantially higher than other provinces, of close to 15% of TB NARDs coming positive, compared to, say, under 5% in KwaZulu-Natal. So perhaps ongoing transmission of bedaquiline resistance. I think that there's some other ideas that perhaps as a result of a higher loss to follow-up rates on bedaquiline-containing regimens in the Western Cape, and the table on the bottom right from EDR Web from Prof. Njeka does suggest that perhaps the Western Cape might have a slightly higher loss to follow-up rate compared to other provinces on patients with bedaquiline exposure. And then lastly, it's possible that the Western Cape is conducting better targeted contact tracing of bedaquiline-resistant contacts in the Western Cape, and therefore sort of identifying more contacts in bedaquiline-resistant cases for bedaquiline PDST testing. There are obviously substantial limitations, and we're using routine data sources, and the coverage of PDST bedaquiline amongst people with RRTD remains under 80% in all provinces, even 3 included in this cross-sectional survey. It's possible that residual linkage errors from the probabilistic linkages are a limitation. They do introduce some noise, despite best efforts to ensure good linkages. And obviously, we do have an issue of late arriving data and data quality and completeness of routine data sources. We haven't yet looked at the culture conversion rates and treatment outcomes amongst those with bedaquiline resistance in the VPAL regimen or VPAL-L. Work to look at this is underway. In terms of strengths, well, we do have a large number of samples, nearly 10,000 tests collected between July and November, and we limited the cross-sectional analysis to provinces with reasonable coverage of the DRTB reflex guidelines. So turning to the conclusions of the test level surveillance, substantial provincial differences in the implementation of the DRTB reflex guidelines is apparent, with the Western Cape achieving substantially higher coverage because of the collection of 2 samples up front. And clearly we need to increase and continue to work to increase the adherence to the DRTB reflex testing algorithm. And I know our National Department and Provincial Department of Health colleagues are working hard to do so. The median turnaround for bedaquiline PDST at 56 days is too long, and this is an issue that's raised at the recent Southern TB conference by Prof. Njeka and others. It remains too long to inform targeted contact tracing or patient management, and so we are looking at the implementation of targeted next generation sequencing to decrease the turnaround time, of bedaquiline resistance testing. And then it's worth noticing that those with bedaquiline resistance fluoroquinolone sensitive, the numbers exceeded the bedaquiline resistant fluoroquinolone tests in more recent months. Turning to the cross-sectional analysis of the 3 provinces of Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, Western Cape, the prevalence of bedaquiline resistance in Western Cape is substantially higher than the other 2 provinces. And we're going to look at whole genome sequencing data to see if that's a clonal expansion. We did see that prior bedaquiline clofazimine exposure is strongly associated with an increased risk of bedaquiline resistance in keeping with prior studies. But more than half of those with bedaquiline resistance had no previous bedaquiline clofazimine exposure, suggesting primary transmitted resistance. And nearly 2/3 of patients with bedaquiline resistance have fluoroquinolone sensitive TB. The prevalence of linezolid resistance, fortunately, was very low, likely the predominant is similarly low. There's no evidence of increase in bedaquiline resistance with calendar time, and the analysis of culture conversion treatment outcomes is going to be conducted. Lastly, to acknowledge everybody, patients, healthcare workers involved in managing and treating patients, the NHLS laboratory staff, huge numbers who conduct these tests, the NICD surveillance data warehouse team, Dr. Trevor Bell, Dr. Stanford Quenda, and Dr. Morgan Mashini, and Leander Shabalala, the NICD Center for TB data manager. I will stop there, and we can take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harry, for such an informative presentation. I just also would like to apologize that due to some technical challenges, there's a large chunk of our colleagues that missed the beginning of the presentation. But we will ensure that at the end of this, the video will be up on our YouTube channel within the next hour rather, which is our YouTube channel is called TB Think Tank South Africa. Do we have any questions from our secretariat to start off with, Mtobo or Frizana?
Yeah, hi Harry, it's Fazana here. Thank you so much for the presentation. I was privileged to listen to it twice because I know you gave it at the World TB Day seminar. I was just thinking while you were speaking that you mentioned that bedaquiline has a long half-life, about 5 months. And then in your limitations, you said that you haven't looked at patients on the BPL-L regimen. So my question is, do you think that because of the long half-life and the shortened regimen, do you think this would further contribute to bedaquiline resistance because it would possibly result in bedaquiline monotherapy because BPL-L is a shortened regimen? I don't know if that makes sense.
Should I go ahead and answer that while we wait for any more questions to come through? It's a good question. Thanks, Fazana. The data from BPL-L regimens does suggest substantial culture conversions fairly early on. Bedaquiline is an incredibly effective drug, and when we combine it with the other drugs in BPL-L, we do anticipate that patients will cure within the time treatment, within the regimen, the time period of the regimen. So I wouldn't envisage that the BPL-L regimen, because of its timing alone, could result in greater bedaquiline resistance. But I do think that we do need to look at this regimen carefully, look at our culture conversion rates, look at our treatment outcomes, and sort of routine conditions, and see what sort of levels of time and culture conversion we're getting, and look at the patients who start off bedaquiline sensitive at the beginning of their regimen, and might have had additional bedaquiline PDSTs done later on in the regimen, and sort of look at the instance of acquisition of bedaquiline resistance amongst these patients. But at this point, I would not expect to find a signal that the BPL-L regimen particularly has a higher risk of generating resistance. I think rather what we're seeing is that as a result of the substantial implementation, and to be clear, my presentation, I hope you all understood that I think the decisions to implement bedaquiline were absolutely the right decisions for the country. But the higher coverage of bedaquiline, we know from modeling studies, is going to result in a higher level of primary bedaquiline resistance over time, and that will exceed the acquired resistance. And actually, that's where our focus, perhaps as the country needs to be shifting, is understanding that we see in substantial proportion of transmitted bedaquiline resistance, or at least that's what appears likely from the data available. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Harry. I'd also just like to encourage people online to send a message, commentary, or question under the Q&A tab. And if somehow questions come after the session, you can still email myself at ngosi@tbthinktank.org. I'd like to just show people what we'll be having next month in Togo whilst wait for any more questions. So please do join us next month on the 19th, on a Monday, same time at 12 noon, where we will have Dr. Bianca and Prof. Graham, who will be speaking on urine TB tests for patients with HIV and expanding diagnostics landscape. So that's what we will have in store for you next month. Dr. Harry, perhaps, would you have any, if we can call them closing remarks, any statements in the absence of questions or comments right now?
Yeah, I think there's one important closing comment to make, in that while we are seeing this somewhat higher prevalence of bedaquiline resistance in the Western Cape, 10% being of concern, we don't actually know what the treatment outcomes on the BPAL-L regimen will be. And you could see that 2/3 of those patients who were fluoroquinolone sensitive, predominant in linazolid, likely very low levels of resistance. The RV mutation mechanism for bedaquiline resistance doesn't provide an absolute bedaquiline resistance, and there is some overlap in there between the sort of patients with RV. Some are, in fact, on PDST would come out sensitive, some positive, some resistant. So I think we really do need to look very carefully going forward at the outcomes of patients who had baseline bedaquiline resistant TB and look at what their outcomes actually are. Now, obviously, we only started the BPAL-L regimen, I think it was September or November, depending which province, or even later, of last year. So the data is accumulating on that, and we will be looking at it as it accumulates and as the data comes through. But that clearly is something we need to carefully look at. I think the other concluding remark is that this issue of people with prior bedaquiline exposure having a higher bedaquiline resistance, that as clinicians we need to be perhaps cautious there. And I gather that the National Committee or Clinical Advisory Committee is looking at this question about patients prior failing on bedaquiline previously, about whether we should or shouldn't be commencing them on a bedaquiline-based regimen. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So does that mean hopefully we'll see you then in the near future with the data still accumulating? We do have a question, Dr. Harry. So this question asks, or rather goes, do you think we should consider the 2 sample collections in Western Cape across the country? Is there enough of a worry on resistance patterns?
Absolutely. I think regardless of the bedaquiline resistance, that the 2 sample collection in the Western Cape has shown the value in terms of the coverage, in terms of the greater coverage, not only bedaquiline, but likely also of XDR cartridge resistance tests. So that's the fluoroquinolones, the second-line injectables, the INH. So the additional value of getting that second sample up front to allow reflex testing is substantial. First of all, we get data at a single time point from a patient rather than sort of over time. Patients come back. We have lower sort of loss to follow-up. We're not subject to patients not coming back for this additional drug-assisted tests. And it's more complex for the clinicians to do one sputum sample, then patient comes back, gets the RIF-R, then we submit a second sample. It adds complexity to the patient management process and perhaps delays. So I certainly think that the 2 samples up front is, from a perspective of the program and patient management, is a good idea. I think though we do need to consider the downsides of such a strategy, though, perhaps, and that is that we're running approximately just under 3 million TB-NAR tests in 2023, collecting 2 samples up front. If those are all new patients, there would be an additional 3 million specimen bottles flowing to the labs, where they have to hold them and store them while they wait for the results of the TB-NAR test and the rifampicin resistant, and discard them for patients, for the vast majority of patients who are going to be either TB negative or going to be RIF-S. And so that does add a burden on the laboratory system, and that is something which needs to be carefully considered. But where labs are able to manage with the storage of the volumes, my recommendation would be that we think about that as a national policy of 2 samples up front. But that policy decision is yet to be taken, as far as I understand, Nolwazi. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your response. So we also have another question that asks, when will the sequencing data be available? And in the interim, are you able to map bedaquiline resistance geographically to look at potential hotspots?
So the answer to the whole genome sequencing is as soon as possible, but we're incredibly short-staffed in terms of analytical capacity with things like the NICD Center for TB. So it is something I want to get to, but we are under pressure with an enormous number of other projects, and I will get to it as soon as we can. In terms of the spatial mapping, yes, we are able to, though we have to understand that that is somewhat difficult, and that the spatial analysis of these patients, as they often sort of flow towards specific sites or centers, can just disturb or the geospatial analysis. So we might find large numbers of patients located within sort of expert drug-resistant TB sites. And so then the analysis of that is complicated because we've got to go back to where they first entered the healthcare service and use that as a proxy marker for, location of transmission, which is, data from other studies, and KwaZulu-Natal and others suggest that might not always be a robust assumption. But yes, we can look at it, and we will look at it once again when we can. But this data is still waiting to get out. So there's a lot of there's a lot on our plate, and we will do so as soon as we can. Thank you.
Thank you. We have lost our last two questions for the session. So our second last one goes, do you have an indication of those with bedaquiline resistance? Of those with bedaquiline resistance relapses or treatment failures?
So this data was really aimed to look at the new guidelines of PDST testing for patients with RIF-R, to use that as a sort of an idea of baseline rather than to look at longitudinal data within individuals. Some of the difficulty, of course, with the longitudinal data, it's quite difficult to do from a centralized national site, in that we are then reliant on the EDR web data to correctly classify patients as previous treatment failures or interruptions, and we are aware that EDR web data is being improved all the time, but the completeness of the data is not always there. So there are some challenges there. I think that there are some individuals that I'm collaborating with who are starting to look at some of that, but I think that that is probably better done with more granular patient level data, where the risk for misclassification bias of exposure is lower. So I'm somewhat reticent to look at it only using routine data without access to participant files and to careful review to ensure that exposure is properly accounted for.
Thank you. And we've heard from about clinicians and patients. And this question, Dr. Harry, is from an advocacy perspective. The question asks, what message should TB activists take note of from this?
That's a good question. I think that the message is that, as expected, bedaquiline resistance, there is a signal, as expected, that transmission of bedaquiline resistant TB is occurring, and that might be occurring in higher levels in some provinces than others. But that resistance was to be expected. So from an advocacy perspective, I think that there are two key messages for them to take away. First of all, that the turnaround time of bedaquiline phenotypic drug sensitivity testing is long, and we know it. It's not a problem of the laboratory. It's a fundamental characteristic of doing culture-based drug-resistant phenotypic drug-resistant tests. And 56 days is a long time for somebody to wait to get a bedaquiline-resistant result. And so the National Department of Health is responding to that with the targeted next generation sequencing implementation. And I suppose the advocates their job is to hold all of our feet to the fire to try and make sure that we get this up and running. All right, and that's, you know, that's activists' jobs to do that. I suppose the second piece is from an activist perspective, is that we do need to perhaps increase the analytical capacity to look at data as it, you know, is generated perhaps slightly more timeously in order to inform and respond to issues arising in the TB program. It's not ideal that we are always a few months behind, and perhaps, you know, the activist community can get behind that idea that turning data into information is actually an important function, and that function needs to be adequately supported. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harry. I'd like to thank you again for your time today, for your presentation. I'd like to thank everyone in attendance for today, and we apologize again for our technical challenges. We will have this presentation on our website and YouTube, which will be shared with you guys shortly. And I'll just say, enjoy the rest of your Monday afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks all. Cheers. Thank you so much,
Thank
Eliza.
you.
Thanks all. Cheers. Bye-bye.